A Simplex converted to a Great Western Railway Prairie Tank Part 83, looking at the best way to extend the spectacle plate. I've placed the original spectacle plate on a piece of brass that recently arrived from Blackgates Engineering, and with the help of the cardboard template I've drawn around it, so I now need to make a complete new part that looks like this. The Cyberman from the Doctor Who TV series. I'm also looking at this job and thinking there's a lot of cutting out to do here. There must be an easier way to make this part. And I do like jobs when I have a safety net. If I make a thorough mess of this job I'm about to show you, I can go back to my Cyberman part and cut it out. This is another piece of brass that I bought from Blackgates Engineering a couple of weeks ago, and I got the measurements wrong, so it's the wrong size. But this piece of brass is almost a perfect fit for the job that I need it to do. Using one of my felt tip deep hole markers, I'm marking out the position where I need to fit this plate. And I'm sorry my hand's in the way in this shot, I really can't help that sometimes. By using a combination of the set square and the piece of brass itself, I arrive at some lines on the main spectacle plate. In this clip you can see how badly the spectacle plate had been cut to accommodate a fake square top firebox. Over now to the bandsaw, and I'm very carefully cutting out the shape that I've scribed on the piece of brass. My scribing of metal parts, as usual, is disgraceful, but at least I know where to cut, and that is the main thing. Sometimes I cut in the wrong place though, but most of the time I get it right, at least when the camera's running and I've pressed record. The next part of the job is to clean up this cut. For this I'm using a fairly coarse file, and the idea is to file to the bottom of the black line. Filing takes a while, it's quite physical, but it's good to do and it's good to learn how to do it. The next part of this job is to set the spectacle plate in the vice jaws, level with the top of the two pieces of brass angle, which I use in this vice most of the time to stop the vice jaws from marking anything that I'm working on. This filing process is known as draw filing. And eventually I got the part as flat as I needed it to be. Then I held a piece of brass in place and marked it out. Then I cut the piece of brass sheet to shape on the bandsaw, and it's quite a good fit in the cutout that I made in the original spectacle plate. You will notice in this episode that a lot of the time I'm working on the bench on top of my surface plate. That's because I need to make sure that the parts I'm about to assemble are all flat. And when I offer the piece of sheet brass up to the spectacle plate in the cutout that I've made, as you can see, the parts appear to be quite flat. If the parts weren't flat, it's at this stage of the job that I would have to straighten them. What I'm doing at the moment is removing all traces of the marking out around the areas on the spectacle plate and the piece of brass, where the two parts meet each other. That's because I'm going to silver solder these together, and I do not want any contamination. First of all though, I need to cut the larger piece of brass to the right shape. I didn't remove the original marks because I need these to line up the cardboard template. Now all I need to do is cut this part out. So it's back over to the bandsaw for another bit of bandsawing. The blade is wandering a bit, that's because the blade guide is not in the right position. I keep it up out of the way for the videos. You can see the blade guide at the top of the picture, and that's the part that needs to be a lot lower than it is. Now it's time to venture into the colder outer part of the workshop. It's quite cold for the 6th of April 2021, but that's okay, it's going to get much hotter in here very shortly. What I'm doing is applying some silver solder flux to the joint. This flux is Easy Flow number 2, and I'm going to use Silver Flow 55 as the silver solder. Before fitting the parts together like this on my brazing hearth, I coated the edge of the smaller piece of brass with the flux, and now I'm putting more flux in from the top. This next part of the job is very important. I haven't really dwelled on it as long as I should have done. You need to get the entire brass panel at least hot, not red hot. But if you dive into the joint like I'm doing now, although quite a bit of time has elapsed and the entire plate is quite hot, it's very likely that the pieces of brass would start to move and warp with the heat. When I make silver soldering videos, I always apply too much silver solder, and this is definitely not an exception to the rule. I'm applying a lot of silver solder here. I want it to run into the gap between the two pieces of brass, and I also want it to run out onto the top of the pieces of brass. You may notice that the spectacle plate doesn't say front on it anymore. Well, it does, but it's on the other side. By silver soldering the part from behind, the silver solder will run down the gap and hopefully stick out a little bit at the front. By now the small stick of silver solder was getting very hot, so I'm using a pair of surgical forceps to hold the last piece. I should have used a new stick of silver solder really, but luckily I had just enough to do the job. The temperature at which you silver solder is fairly critical. If you don't have enough heat, the silver solder will just sit on top of the work in the form of blobs. As the silver solder temperature gets near to its melting point, it starts to spread out. And once the silver solder melts into the gap, you need to apply a little bit more heat just to make it go in there properly, otherwise you can get a crystalline brittle joint. It's all about practice and feel really. If you're not sure about how to do this, try it with a couple of scrap pieces of brass first and test the strength after you've done it. Leaving sufficient time for the parts to cool. Once again, I'm using one of the most useful tools I have in the workshop other than myself to clean up the silver solder on the top part of the brass. You really have to use one of these Proxxon angle grinders to see what a sensitive piece of equipment it is. Press on hard, it removes a lot. Press on gently and it has more of a polishing operation. But don't forget, it is fitted with the flapper wheel, not a cutting disc. The part I'm working on at the moment is the rear of the spectacle plate. I'm actually going to turn it round from the position it was in originally. This was the front, and as you can see I marked the brass by using the chisel to knock off the rivet heads. After using the angle grinder to remove all of the excess silver solder, I then used a piece of 180 grit emery cloth. The strange thing is, at the beginning of this video, the cutout that I was going to make on the big sheet of brass looked very much like a Cyberman from the Doctor Who series, but strangely enough, now the part seems to resemble a Space Invader from the old arcade game. After cleaning up the spectacle plate, there are a couple of blemishes. I'm going to show you how to fix them. To be honest, these blemishes are so slight you could fix them just using the primer when you come to paint the thing. But instead I'm going to do this in a more professional manner, quite similar to the way that they repair bodywork on vintage cars. I'm going to use some soft solder. Soft solder melts at a far lower temperature than silver solder. There's no danger of me unsoldering the silver solder with this small blowtorch. All I'm needing to do is fill this very slight imperfection, and this, by the way, is the inside part of the spectacle plate. The small angle grinder with very little pressure soon makes short work of the soft solder. And now the part looks like this. I need to still do a little bit of work on this. On one side was a notch to clear what was left of the beading on top of the tank. The notch isn't big enough anyway, so I need to make this a bit longer, which I'm just about to do, and now when I refit it you will see that it fits much better over the bit of beading on the tank. That's more like it. The final part of the job is to slightly reprofile the part that fits over the boiler, and as you can see here, not only have I done that, I've cut a slot at the other side to match, and as I didn't want the brass plate to touch the paintwork, I've trimmed it away at each side. There you have it. This is the original spectacle plate fitted with an extension, thanks to some silver solder and a bit of elbow grease. Try joining brass this way yourself, it's actually quite interesting. Stay healthy, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.